Okay, hi. I'm Claire. I'm talking today about the killing of America and Videodrome. So I'm gonna start with the killing of America. The Killing of America was a 1982 Japanese-American documentary film directed by Sheldon Renan and Leonard Schreider. It was narrated by Chuck Riley, who is an American voice actor and voiceover artist, and edited by Lee Percy. The film premiered in New York City in February 1982 at the Public Theater and in LA at the New Art Theater, but it did not receive a commercial release in the United States at that time. It premiered in Japan in September 1981, and it was released on home video in Britain in the same year. It only received a wide release in Japan when some of its footage was altered. The footage in question was the footage at the end during the John Lennon Memorial Vigil. Instead of ending with the words that two people had been shot during the vigil, a series of shots of the peace vigils for John Lennon were placed at the end, and no narration was used in order to make it less depressing for audiences. The Killing of America was only released on DVD in the United States in February 2002 and was re-released in October 2016 on Blu-ray. Critical reception to The Killing of America has been very mixed. At the time, Janet Maslin of the New York Times called the movie exploitative and incoherent, and viewing was really limited in the United States. Not many people saw it or were completely captivated by it when they first saw it, and for a couple of reasons. The film is pretty grim and stark, and focuses a lot on, our country's penchant for violence, which many people don't want to engage with in their free time. It combines archival footage of shootings from the 1960s and early 1980s to the early 1980s, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Charles Whitman's University of Texas sniper shooting, and John Hinckley's attempt on Ronald Reagan's life, as well as interviews with serial killers like Edmund Kemper, and law enforcement officials, tied together with narration, which, I said before, by Chuck Riley. And these characteristics made it increasingly similar to something called a Mondo film. A Mondo film is a subgenre of exploitation films and documentary films. Mondo films are made to resemble like a pseudo-documentary kind of, and they depict sensational topics like sex or death. They also often include portrayals of foreign cultures, which often draw condemnations about the ethnocentrism and racism involved in those depictions. There's also an emphasis on taboo subjects like death and sex, and stage sequences presented as genuine documentary footage, so not all the scenes in those Mondo films are real. Over time, the films placed increased emphasis on footage of the dead and dying, real and fake. And the term shockumentary is also used to describe these kind of films. The term mondo is derived from the Italian word for world. The genre is also noted for graphic footage of death and deceased people, often shown in many such films, and it leads to the other popular name of death film. The Killing of America shares a few of these characteristics, specifically in its unapologetic show of violent death and footage of dying bodies. Unlike these shockumentaries, though, The Killing of America uses only genuine footage. None of it is staged, and the only culture it depicts is that of the American killing culture, the American culture of violence. Many people also did not want to see it because it was unoptimistic. There was no call to action or real solution presented during the film to fix any of the problems that the movie addressed. The best that you got from the film was Imagine playing over the scene of John Lennon's vigil, and a note saying that 2 people were shot during the vigil. And the end of the movie, of course, commences with the statistics of how many people died while actually watching the film, which couldn't have made it better for anybody. But what's really remarkable about The Killing of America isn't that people forgot about it or people didn't want to watch it, but it's that it's so relevant now. I read a few articles about how The Killing of America, while relevant in the 1980s, has become even more super relevant now due to our own issues with gun violence, gun control, police brutality, systematic violence. It's a deliberate message that pervades every inch of the film that we still need to listen to now. The Killing of America was produced by 3 people. Madahiro Yamamoto, a Japanese producer, Leonard Schreider, who was a writer and older brother of Taxi Driver screenwriter Paul Schreider, and Sheldon Renan, who is a film archivist and author, who got the inspiration for developing a film like this from writing a screenplay about a hitman called Hollow Point. In 1979, Leonard Schreider introduced Renan to Yamamoto, and they decided Renan was an ideal collaborator for The Killing of America because he'd done the extensive research for Hollow Point before, because he was spending time with actual hitmen while researching that movie. I read a couple interviews, and when asked about their intentions regarding the film, Renan said, we were just trying to make a commercial picture about something that bothered all of us. So it came from a place where they were inspired by a problem that they all saw to create something. In 1980, they began putting the documentary together. Renan was director, Schreider was writing the narration that would later be read. They wanted to argue that President Kennedy's 1963 assassination had unleashed something insidious, a wave of violence that washed over the country. A quote from something I read, "The anger of the disenfranchised expressed through gunfire." They laid out statistics about America's high rates of gun ownership, our elevated rates of homicide, and as I said before, they offered no solutions to these problems. They just let these facts wash over the viewer, punctuated by some gruesome footage. The Killing of America has actually surfaced in different versions, some of them condensed down from longer running times. In the 90-minute version, which I think I watched, it's shorter than Renan says he prefers it to be, but the film, during the film, you retrace the lives of serial killers, rapists, snipers, countless other individuals who wreaked their violence over America. I watched the show Mindhunter, and the Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, I remember him from that show. He was featured heavily in The Killing of America. He had a one-on-one interview. But Renan said that the real focus of the film, and in getting down and dirty with the criminals and people who have committed these acts of violence, is to erase the line between them and us, to turn the audience into murderers, to recognize themselves and recognize the potential that we have for violence and the potential that they acted upon. Another point about the making of The Killing of America is that even while they were writing and filming and shooting, new incidents were happening all again and again every day. Lenin's assassination and Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt all happened while they were still trying to make this movie, and Renan described it as hard to keep up with everything and difficult to comprehend the tremendous scale of the violence. Public response kind of mirrored that it was hard to watch. When the film premiered at the New Art Theater in 1981, Renan estimated that a third of the audience left, just walked out, because even if they had already seen some clips of the footage on the news, like of John F. Kennedy's assassination, they just walked out because they couldn't handle it. They couldn't watch these acts of violence painted on a screen, stark, unforgiving, in front of their eyes. And really, the only thing that really survived about The Killing of America in that era, the remembrance of it, was Janet Maslin's review in the New York Times. The film found an audience in Japan, but many people who worked on it were embarrassed that they had been involved. There was controversy raised that they were giving killers platforms, like Sirhan Sirhan. He had an interview in the movie, and people thought that they were giving too much leeway and depth to people who had committed these acts of violence. But another emotion was also evoked that probably contributed to people's negative viewing experience, and that's sadness. There's a connection between America's thirst for violence and the easy availability of powerful weapons, and that evokes a deep sadness in some people, a deep sadness that this is the way the system has devolved, this is the violence that we're experiencing and growing up in, and when you're confronted with it, you're gripped by this deep sadness and horror. Many people who worked on the movie put the experience behind them. Renan, including, lost his copy of the VHS. But it gained a cult following in Japan, as I said already, and actually gained a cult following in Australia, a country that banned its semi-automatic weapons, in 1996. but it had this re-release on Blu-ray in 2016, and now the movie, it's more relevant than ever because of the message. Every day we see on the news scenes of onlookers reacting to mass shootings or hostage situations, and it feels like the movie could have been made yesterday with how relevant some of the ideas are. So it's crazy, and the movie has even more value then than it has now, because we see that we haven't really changed from how we have been in the past to where we are now. It's a wake-up call. Videodrome, it's obviously fictional, but it has similarities and differences to The Killing of America. Videodrome is a 1983 Canadian science fiction body horror film with a running time of 89 minutes, so it's actually about the same length of time that I spent watching The Killing of America. It was directed by David Cronenberg, it was edited by Ronald Sanders, and the cinematography was done by Mark Irwin, and the music was done by Howard Shore. It stars James Woods, Sonia Smites, and Debbie Harry. I know we all watched it, but it's set in Toronto in the early 1980s, and it follows a small UHF, ultra-high-frequency TV station, and a man who stumbles on a broadcast signal showing a show with extensive violence and torture. Max Wren, the main character, slowly loses touch with reality through a series of bizarre hallucinations as he struggles to find the source of the show. It was distributed by Universal Pictures, and that's important because this was the first of Cronenberg's movies to receive backing from a major studio, which also led to this being his most expensive film. He got a $5.9 million budget to make this film, but it was a huge bomb at the box office. It only made $2.1 million, so it was a little bit of a disappointment for him. But it received pretty much universal praise for the special effects, for his own direction, for James Woods and Debbie Harry's performances, for the aesthetic, which was described as surrealist, and the psychosexual themes that pervaded most of the movie. The basis for the film came from Cronenberg's childhood. Cronenberg used to pick up television signals from Buffalo, New York late at night after Canadian stations had gone off the air, and he worried that he might see something disturbing that wasn't meant for public consumption. So that paranoia kind of fueled the script. When, as a young man, he attended the University of Toronto, he studied science, but he gained his degree in literature. And he gained many ideas and influences for Videodrome. The film began as a rough draft called Network of Blood, but after the box office success of Scanners, Cronenberg turned down the chance of directing Return of the Jedi or a Scanners sequel because he didn't want to direct material made by other filmmakers. So he met with a man named Pierre David in Montreal to discuss ideas for a new film. Cronenberg pitched two ideas, one of which was Videodrome. He admits that he was worried that the project would be rejected due to the excessive violent content, but it was approved. It was originally, the earlier drafts had much more violent scenes, but they managed to tone them down to avoid too much backlash. He chose James Woods for the character of Max Wren. Debbie Harry was picked for the character of Nikki. Principal photography for the film began on October 19th, 1981, and ended in December, with the initial week of filming devoted to videotaping monitor inserts for the scenes where they used the monitor. 3 different endings were filmed for the movie. The ending that was used in the final film, where Max shoots himself, was James Woods' idea. One of the initial intentions for the ending was to include an epilogue after the suicide, where Max, Bianca, and Nikki appear on the set of Videodrome. Bianca and Nikki are shown to have chest slits like Max. Cronenberg described his original version of the ending as following: after the suicide, Max ends up on the Videodrome set with Nikki. They hug and kiss. It's like a happy ending, but it's a happy ending where the Videodrome has conquered. They are on the set, it's covered in blood, the TV show has won, and humanity has lost. Kind of the poor man's happy ending. The special makeup effects, which were met with critical acclaim, were devised by Rick Baker, who did the effects for American Werewolf in London. To create the breathing effects of the television set that Max interacts with, they utilized an air compressor with valves hooked to a piano keyboard. The undulating screen of the television set was created using a video projector and a sheet of rubbery dental dam. They had to use Betamax video cassettes she inserted into the stomach slit because VHS cassettes were too large. Baker's original concept for Max's flesh gun featured eyes, mouth, and foreskin, which they found to be too graphic. There were a bunch of other different effects that they used. The cancerous tumors burst out from the body of Barry Kovacs. It included his crew operating a dummy underneath the set and having the organs writhe around. Lennick, who was special effects supervisor, Mike Lennick, I think. Yeah, Mike Lennick. Devised effects like having the image of the Videodrome television set distort whenever he would use the device called the Videodromer, but some of these were cut for time and budget concerns. The film holds a mix of good and bad ratings. It's been described as visually audacious, disorienting, and just plain weird. Videodrome's blessings on technology and entertainment and politics still feel fresh today. Disturbing techno-surrealist film, burningly intense, chaotic, indelibly surreal, absolutely like nothing else. Janet Maslin also reviewed this movie. She called it, she remarked on the film's innovativeness and praised Woods' performance as having a sharply authentic edge. Other reviewers called it a perfect example of body horror, wrote that the film proves more fascinating than distancing, commended the stunning visual effects. I could find one negative review. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post called it simultaneously stupefying and boring. There was a novelization that was released by Zebra Books alongside the movie in 1983 that included some scenes that had to be deleted from the film. But for a bigger discussion, some of the themes that were addressed in Videodrome, obviously psychosexual violence, some of those themes were addressed. Other themes include corruption. Videodrome is used by a corporation in order to create tumors in a person who watches, killing people who are considered lowlifes for watching so-called reality or trash TV. The corrupt ideology of a group of people in a powerful position is pushed upon the world in order to have the agenda acted out in the world. Another one is TV as a control, to control the minds of the masses and give them whatever message that they want pervaded. Overstimulation. Overstimulation is achieved through repeated violent sequences of the film, a technique that is also shared by The Killing of America. By the end of both films, you're just completely drained and exhausted by the violence that you've been watching. You're completely overstimulated. Another similarity between them, the articles that I read extolled how The Killing of America and Videodrome tackled current topics that have relevance even now. I talked about it a little bit with Killing of America, but gun violence and the need for control and the pervasive and relentless media influence in our lives are just as important now as they were in the 80s, perhaps even more important because they've progressed to such new heights and new technology has exacerbated this growth. Some other similarities, the television station run by the main character Max Wren shows mostly sensationalist programming, a point that mirrors the content of The Killing of America and the Mondo films that took some of its visual cues from. Both can be described as sensationalist because it shows such graphic violence. The graphic depictions of violence themselves heavily feature, and they link between sex and violence in both of the movies, as I said before. The undercurrent of sexual violence, as I already said. Videodrome deals with it at times with specific imagery, the tape being inserted into the slit in Max's chest, the impalement on scissors, the sadomasochistic character of Nikki, and the way her and Max become sexually involved after he watches Videodrome. In The Killing of America, it's mirrored by the interviews with Ed Kemper and Ted Bundy, how they receive close scrutinization. It allows that there is a larger problem of violence, that's the main focus, but the problem of sexual violence constitutes a large part of the discussion, especially in the 70s, and it's shown that it continues into the 80s with Videodrome. Obviously, the differences include Videodrome being a fictional piece and Killing of America being non-fiction, meant to be taken as a deliberate message, warning against the dangers of gun violence and aiming for gun control. In this case, both of them have deliberate messages that they seek to carry, even if there are other ways of interpreting Videodrome. Both are intensely interesting movies that can be watched over and over again to mine for new facts and new themes. But this is really long, so I'm going to cut this off and just say that both movies are definitely worth watching and provide some interesting dialogue during that period about the nature of violence and how it was being shown to the American people.